You better pay attention because today it's 10 note reading tips beginners need. So our tips today are going to go from most obvious to least obvious. The first tip, even though it's the most obvious, is something students get wrong a lot, and that is you always want to read notes from the bottom, starting from the bottom to the top. Don't do it any other way. If you do it consistently from the bottom to the top, it'll help eliminate confusion and help you read notes faster, and it's helpful for tip number 2, which is you can memorize notes by associating mnemonic devices with the lines and spaces of each clef. Ready? If you don't know it, I'm going to explain it in less than 20 seconds. Go! Lines of the treble clef from the bottom to the top, of course, are E, G, B, D, and F, or every good boy deserves fries. And spaces of the treble clef are F, A, C, E, also spells the word bass. Ready for the lines of bass clef? Ready, go. Lines of bass clef are G, B, D, F, and A, or good boys deserve fries always. Spaces of the bass clef from the bottom to the top, of course, are A, C, E, G, or all cows eat grass. Got it? Good. Tip number 3, of course. Let's get into it. So tip number 3 is that when you are practicing your lines and spaces for each clef, doesn't matter whether it's on the space or on ledger lines, you definitely want to start simple. You don't want to overcomplicate things. So let me show you exactly what I mean. So here on the staff, when I'm first learning the treble clef, I'm just going to start by learning the lines and just practice the lines on their own. And actually, I'm even going to simplify it further just by practicing the bottom line and the line above it. So I'm just going to practice the difference between these two lines, and that's it. And then once I know that that's E, that's G, then I'm going to add B into the mix. And I'm really just going to practice figuring out the difference between those 3 notes. And then you're going to add another note each time. And then once you get those 4, you add another one. So what you want to do is be methodical about it. You want to learn and master comparing 2 different things and then add one thing on each time. And then once you get the treble clef lines, you want to do the treble clef spaces. Same thing, just compare 2 of them, add one in each time. And then basically, then you want to add them together. Same thing with the bass clef. You want to start with your lines, memorize those, compare those 2, just the G and the B there, and then the G, B, and the D. I think you get the idea until you get all those. And then the spaces. But here's where the tip gets interesting, because back when I was a young lad, I don't even say lad, I'm in America, but when I was a young boy, when I was learning piano, I learned the treble clef, lines of spaces, did it just the way I said, no problems. Learned the bass clef, lines of spaces, just the way I said, no problems. But what happened over a few months is I was playing a lot of pieces that had a lot more notes in the treble clef, just chords in the left hand. So I wasn't really reading the left hand anymore in terms of the notes. So what happened over a couple months is I kind of lost the left hand. I only really knew how to play the right hand. The left hand had kind of fallen out. So I actually had to go back and do the simplification again. So the part 2 of this tip is even after you've built things slowly and methodically, like I said, go back sometimes. Sometimes you'll need to go back and do that again, and don't be afraid to do that or think that you've lost progress by doing that. This happens to everybody, and it's a normal thing, and I just want to let you know about it. But you need to also know about tip number 4, which is, so tip number 4, which blew my mind when I first learned about it back like a whole 3 years ago when somebody mentioned it in a live stream, is that the lines of whatever staff that you're on are the same as the spaces, starting from that top space, going up off the staff. So what that means in terms of figuring out ledger lines is it makes things a lot easier, because now we have E here, G, G, B, B, D, D, and then if I had one up here, what note would that be? Oh, it would be F. So knowing that basically, if you correlate each of these notes to one another, you can figure them out really quickly, because before, without it, what note is this one? It's like, who knows? But if you know that they correlate to the lines, it's every good boy deserves, so that would be a D right there. Okay, now get this. This is the best part. So lines on the staff are equal to spaces off the staff. But what if you did spaces on the staff? Well, guess what? The spaces on the staff are equal to the lines starting from the top line going up off the staff. So you can use that to your advantage to figure out what all these notes are. So obviously, like this one here, before it's like, well, what note is that? It's like, who knows? You could count them. It would take forever. But if you know that it's a line you just go, okay, I know that that's F, and I just know it's F, A, C, E. So I know that that's E. But that's how it works. So the lines on one staff is equal to the spaces going up off that staff. The spaces on a staff are equal to the lines starting from the top line going up off the staff. It works the same way going below the staff, but in reverse order. You got to be careful. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. So the inverse is true. So if you have spaces on the staff, that's actually equal to the lines going down below the staff. But you got to be careful because now you're going down this way. Before we were going up, which remember I always said read from the bottom to the top, F, A, C, E. Well, this time it's in reverse order. So really this top note is this one. They're an octave apart. Of course, need to mention that. Somebody will let me know in the comments. So all of these notes correlate to each other. You just got to know that the top note correlates to the top note, that note to that note, that note to that note, and then the bottom one to the bottom one. So you just got to be careful that it's in a reverse order, but it's literally the same thing. Anyway, let's get on to tip number 5, which is tip number 5 is actually a super important one if you want to read music really fast. And that is, in addition to reading notes individually, you know, the F, A, C, E, E, G, B, D, and F, all that stuff, you can actually figure out notes quickly by determining how far apart they are by using something called intervals. I have a whole lesson on intervals. In fact, I have a few of them. I'm going to put them in a link in the description for you. But this is how it works. So say you have 2 notes. See how when these notes are this close together, that they are literally clustered side by side? That's what's called a second. That literally means that the notes are 2 notes apart. Let me show you on the piano. So it literally means these notes are 2 apart. You got E and then you got F right there. So that is what is called a second. And seconds, remember, seconds are always right next to each other. It doesn't matter where on the staff the second appears. You always know it's a second because seconds, like I said, are the only one. They're so close together that they stack side by side, just like that. So all you've really got to do now, instead of reading these notes individually, C and D, you just read the bottom one, C, and you know right away that the next one is a second above that. That would look like that. And those will be those 2 notes right there. Now you may be saying, well, I can read those individual notes, no problem. Oh, really? So let me show you what would happen once you start getting, you know, something, you start playing jazz music or something. Okay, you won't have a chord like this, but say you have this chord, right? And you're like, oh man, okay, so now I got you. Now you might be like, all right, it'll take me a minute or 2 to figure this out if you've been you're pretty new to playing. So let's do this. Let's identify these in terms of the interval that we talked about, which the only one so far was a second. Look, there's a second, there's a second, and there's a second. So you can really read just the bottom notes of these, E, A, and D, and just know that the other ones are a second apart. So that would kind of look like this. You got E and F, you had A and B, and then you had D and E. And you see those clusters of seconds. So just a quick example of how you can use the clusters and the intervals, as we call them, to your advantage. Now let me show you just really quick a little bit more. Like I said, I have full lessons just on intervals because we could be here literally all day. But one thing I want to tell you is thirds. The beginning, it looks like the beginning of a stack of snowmen, right? You got the first, you got the bottom, and then you got the torso. Except they're the same size. It's like if your 5-year-old niece built a snowman. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether they're on lines or spaces. See how they're still just evenly stacked like that? So the thing you got to keep in mind is that with odd number intervals, 3, 5, 7, 9, that's how odd number intervals work. Those always match. That means if the bottom one is on a line, the next one's going to be on the line. If the next one's on a space, the next one's going to be on the space. However, if you remember with the second, this one, that the bottom one was a space, but the next one was a line, and that was an even number interval. So even number intervals, they don't match, meaning if one's a line, the other is going to be a space. If one's a space, the other one's going to be a line. So you can use thirds to your advantage, and you can memorize them basically all the way up through, I would learn at least up to an octave. But again, a whole lesson on it, check it out. Let's get on to tip number 6, which is building on this, which is learning how to play and identify chords. Now, a chord is really when, typically we know chords as like triads, which are 3-note chords. You want to learn all of your triads, and there's actually quite a few that you want to be aware of. I'll just quickly run them down for you. You want to be aware of major triads. They sound happy. You got minor triads. They sound not happy, aka sad. You have diminished triads, which sound scary, and augmented triads, which sound kind of mysterious and scary. So you want to learn at least those 4. You want to learn them in all the different keys. There are websites to this. Remind me, and I'll put a link in the description to where you can begin learning and mastering your chords. I don't want to get, and then after that there are 7th chords, which are 4-note chords, also called 7th chords, but we're not going to get into nitty gritty of chords today. How does this apply to reading music, and how is this going to help you? Well, just like the intervals, you could identify a second from sight, knowing like, okay, there's an E, the next one must be an F. This is the same type of idea, except it's just building on a little bit more information. So because I've been playing piano so long and learning this so long, I can, by sight, identify this chord as an F major 7th chord. And if I had a flat on it, it would be an F dominant 7th chord. How do I know that? I've been learning my chords for a long time. So I don't have to read literally like, okay, that's an F, okay, that's an A, okay, that's a C, okay, that's an E flat. I know them all, you know, and I've been practicing them for a long time. So it's really just giving yourself a lot more information to go on to read notes quickly, which kind of brings us to the next one, which is learning all of your scales, all of your key signatures. Again, this is something you'll have to practice on your own, but all a scale really is basically when you're playing notes all in a row within a key. And those are arpeggios. I didn't even mention arpeggios, but you probably want to learn those as well. But anyway, you got your scales, which is being able to play beginning to end. And then each key tells you really like what sharps or flats you have in each piece. You want to memorize those as well. Not going to get in the nitty gritty of that. That's not what today's lesson is about. I'm going to put a link for you in the description after the lesson's done, because now we're going to do tip number 8 is a great one. It's very applicable. Well, they're all very applicable. Tip number 8 is to look over your music first and look for repeated patterns in the music. This is the most useful thing you could possibly do, because take a look at this. You see how there's 4 lines of music here. That's how you count. But here's the thing. You may be like, oh, I have to learn all 4 lines of this piece. Well, the great thing about music in general is it's very repetitive. You know, I always heard my grandma be like, I don't get music today. It's very repetitive. It's just the same thing over and over again. It's like, oh yeah, well, what about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, rock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, rock. It's like the same thing. You know, you have your repeated kinds of things, not just in the lyrics, but in the music itself. And let me show you. So you see how you have B, 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 G, A, B. Well, hey, look, B, 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 G, A, B. And now these notes change a little bit, but that's okay. So once you get this line down, you really have the first half of this line already learned. But you'd be surprised, like if you're not on the lookout for the patterns, you might not notice that. You might be literally rereading everything again, even though you might not have to. So be on the lookout for those patterns. Same thing with the right hand and the left hand. Like you see that even the left hand copies here, but the left hand is a little bit different there. See how here are actually the same as these. So actually, once you learn these 2 measures, you really have 6 measures of the whole thing learned. So be on the lookout for all those patterns. There's patterns in chords, there's patterns in notes, and by identifying these patterns, you're going to be able to fill in the spaces. That's what reading music fast is all about. Giving yourself tons of information so you can look at groups of notes and not just read them as individual notes, but be able to be like, okay, there's an F major 7th chord. There's a G dominant 7th chord. You know, a C half diminished 7th chord, things like that. You know, the 9th tip I have for you today is actually very, very important. And a lot of students get this wrong, even if they've been learning a long time. And if you do this correctly, you'll be able to learn anything a lot faster. And that is always start your practice session with what you're least good at. So when you're reading music, say you really struggle with those ledger lines that we talked about earlier, going up off the staff. So the thing you should do is when you start practicing, you should start from the ledger lines if that's what you're struggling with. So don't start from the lines and spaces if you have them memorized, you've had them memorized for months. Start from the hard part. Same thing with the music that you're playing. If you have a certain measure you always mess up at, well, guess what? Where you should start your practice session from that measure. So always start what you're not good at. And then the last one is the most important tip of all, which is to watch the next lesson on reading music. Like I said, I have a lot of lessons on using intervals and using chords. I've had a lot of lessons about this before. This is like really the first main tips video, putting it kind of all together for you. Remember, there's links in the description where you can learn more, but make sure you check out the next video right here for that intervals. Anyway, thanks everybody. Been Tim here, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Have a great day.